All right, so hey there, AP Europeans. In this video, we're going to take a look at topic 6.8, social reform in the 19th century. This is coming in at the later part of the unit where we've already kind of introduced changes from the Industrial Revolution and from the revolutions of the 1830s and of 1848 and all of the ideological isms that are out there floating as new ideas. Here in this topic, we're going to see how people are starting to take a little bit more action to make some significant changes in their day-to-day lives. And just like we've seen in other parts of Unit 6, it's important here to kind of differentiate what we mean by the people. When we are talking about social reforms, it kind of looks different whether you're talking about middle class or if you're talking about the working classes. For the middle class focus, and I'll click a couple times and just get up here that we can see that this is a middle class focus, you're going to start seeing political parties as an element of growth. This is only going to be able to start happening once you get more people with a right to vote. So more on that here between 6.8 and topic 6.9. But political parties are going to become the primary vehicle to make changes in society, whether you're talking about social reforms or if you're talking about economic reforms or political reforms as far as the government functions. Political parties are going to be the driving force. So as a look ahead to what's going to show up in Unit 7 going through until obviously the modern day, a lot of emphasis comes into political parties, but they really have their origins here in the 19th century, here in the peak growth period of the Industrial Revolution. For working class populations, these social reforms are really kind of based around the development of labor unions. We've talked about in class how labor unions were seen as controversial and as a threat to a stable society in the aftermath of the French Revolution. But by the time you get to the middle part of the century, especially after the revolutions of 1848, people are, well, I guess governments are more willing and more able to listen to the demands of the working classes and labor unions because listening to those demands seems to be a good alternative to having to deal with armed insurrection as it comes and goes. So I think what you kind of see here between these two elements coming together is sort of like this development towards political parties on both sides, which is a callback to the radicalism or the republicanism that we saw back in 6.7, where there was a call for universal male suffrage at least, and more on that as a concept here in a few minutes. But this is something that is kind of like in some ways is seen as a natural outgrowth of that type of political movement, that you listen to this political movement through the radicals and you just kind of ease it into a more legitimized decision-making process through political parties. And that's going to kind of help stabilize, well, social changes without there having to be an ongoing problem of ongoing revolutions. I think it's important to point out here, though, that we are talking about changes that are being initiated from non-governmental movements. The political parties, technically speaking, although we think about politicians being a member of a party as they are working for the government, technically speaking, political parties are kind of distinct from those kind of government actions. So when you think about this, political parties and these other NGOs, non-governmental organizations, these are groups of people that are trying to take some sort of action to initiate some sort of change. And across Europe, and again, we're a lot of focus here on the British. A lot of these NGOs, they are religious in nature. Maybe the most dominant of which is going to be this kind of like broad scale movement that we just kind of classify as the Sunday school movement. This is the idea that when you're talking about kids and you're talking about child labor and you're talking about sort of pushing children into a lot of adult sort of positions, well, church-based Sunday schools are going to be religious education, so there's a moral education that comes into play. But since there's no other real kind of schooling available for working class children, this is also going to be a focus on literacy, like reading and writing and trying to take up the cause to better yourself as a person. And so this is going to kind of like help the growth process towards establishment of schools when you look at this in the 19th century. And we'll come back and touch on that movement a little bit more when we get to topic 6.9. Another example of big reform movements that are coming in is an ongoing effort to try to end serfdom and end slavery. Now, serfdom is, I guess, the distinction on this. Serfdom is a type of slavery where there is enslavement of European peasants. And the slavery that's being mentioned in here, this is more about the transatlantic slave trade and enslaving of Africans through the colonial system that we saw all the way back in units 1 and 2. When this is being spearheaded by the British abolitionist movement, and like I think it makes a lot of sense that the British are kind of on the cutting edge of a lot of this because they were the cutting edge on a lot of the changes they were making in a negative way from the Industrial Revolution, altogether. The abolitionist movement kind of has its start going back into the late 18th century, and by the 1830s, this man, William Wilberforce, is a member of Parliament, and he is instrumental in abolishing the slave trade and ultimately abolishing the practice of slavery as a labor source in any British colonies. The abolition of the slave trade happens in the 1830s, like right just before and kind of continuing just after Wilberforce's death. But this is like kind of a significant change. If this is a person that you've never heard of before, the kind of like, name drop recognition I'll give for him here, when Abraham Lincoln was kind of drafting the Emancipation Proclamation, he kind of gave a lot of credit to William Wilberforce and even said that when it comes down to the abolition of slavery, that Wilberforce's name should always be remembered as the most instrumental political figure towards the abolition of slavery. And that's coming from Abe Lincoln, so I think that's pretty good. I think that's pretty good endorsement right there. Another category of these non-governmental movements is going to be assistance going to the poor. And so this is like looking at working class, impoverished working class Europeans specifically, or again, we're talking about, in England. So you've got the temperance movement, which is an anti-alcohol movement. This is really kind of targeting working class Englishmen and working class Europeans, where alcohol abuse was seen as not just as a health issue, but it's seen as an economic issue because you have people that aren't getting paid much money, and the money is being spent on drinks. This is also seen as a domestic social issue because in a lot of cases, the temperance movement is kind of a stand-in for domestic abuse as an issue. That the concern was working class men were abusing alcohol and were sort of creating this as a domestic violence excuse. And so as women are getting involved in the temperance movement, both in Western Europe and in the United States, this is really kind of seen as being a stand-in for that cycle of domestic abuse that seems to be very prominent in the 19th century. And a key figure to drop in here as well, both on the temperance movement and on other movements with focusing on assistance to the poor, is Josephine Butler. They talk about her some in the textbook. She is a real advocate for feminism and women's rights. More on this in a few minutes. But then also she is an advocate for trying to protect the family structure in working class households. And what she sees as a real problem with this is the growth of prostitution in major European cities. And so she is trying to shift the legality issue around prostitution and take it where instead of blame being placed squarely on working class women who have been, for economic reasons, forced into prostitution, trying to turn this more to the middle class men that in a lot of cases are their clients, where this seems to be, from her perspective, an example of abuse from the middle classes to the working class that she is going to work to try to resolve by focusing on assisting the poorer working class elements in, well, British society. All right, so like I was saying, Josephine Butler was also actively involved in the feminist movement, kind of pushing for women's rights. The 19th century is a real key generational time period as the beginning, an earnest beginning of what we refer to as the feminist movement. Depending on which area, which social class we're talking about, again, this is going to kind of go in different ways. There are, instances where women are focused on the working class side of this, where the real goal is to try to improve working conditions. A lady that is actively involved in this is Flora Tristan. And, through the first part of the 19th century, she is actively trying to push for women's rights in the workplace. A little bit, it's not exactly the equal pay kind of thing, but it is about trying to get safer working conditions for women. It is about trying to make sure women are going to be treated with a similar nature as men begin to get their improvements in their working conditions and in their pay scales. And Flora Tristan, ultimately speaking, by the time you get to the middle to the mid part of the century, closer to like the 1840s and 1850s, she kind of turns more towards socialism as a primary advocate for women's rights in the workplace. And so kind of an interesting take here where, like you were saying back in the isms, back on topic 6-7, that socialism really kind of offered one of the only real avenues for women's equality so far as working conditions are concerned. Middle class women and also working class women as well, there is a real push towards legal, economic, and political rights. This is really kind of focused in on what we would call first wave feminism. First wave feminism is really centered around the legal status of women, making sure that women are going to receive equal treatment when it comes down to property rights. And property rights kind of fits into the legal and the economic on this, because the right for women to like own land in their own name as opposed to being in their husband's name. This is a change that's going to happen increasingly through the 19th century. The real focus on this, when you're talking about the economic rights, a little bit separate from the working class working rights. And so the middle class here is going to be a real centerpiece of this part of the feminist movement. Harriet Taylor, you see here on the picture on the right, and her husband John Stuart Mill, they are really actively, public rallies and public speeches and publishing literature, trying to make a clear, logical argument towards equality in women's rights altogether, but specifically with the suffrage movement, trying to get the right to vote for women. This is a very hard fought process where there's a lot of resistance coming from, I mean, politicians and other members of other reform movements. This is a very difficult process, and it is going to take into the 20th century for women to get the right to vote across Europe. In the UK and in Germany, it really kind of happens in the years right around and just after World War I. But in other parts of Europe, it's going to happen like much later than that. Switzerland and I think Norway, women don't get the right to vote in those two countries until you get closer to 1980, as opposed to the time period we're talking about here, which is really kind of capping off in the 1890s. So these reform movements, there is some progress that is being made, but it's not like there is an achievement of social equality that's kind of just magically popping out of nowhere through through these reforms coming from outside the government. For this to happen, it's going to take a little bit more government activity to make this happen. And so we'll see that coming up in topic 6-9, and even more so when we get to Unit 7. Thanks for listening.